The hearing room on the second floor of the county building was already standing room only when Harold Meacham walked through the door. Farmers from 3 neighboring towns had driven in before sunrise. A few brought their wives, one brought his pastor. Everyone in the room understood what was about to happen. The county was going to take Harold's farm. The official term was condemnation. The county had filed an eminent domain action against the Meacham property 6 months earlier, claiming the 160 acres of bottomland along Cedar Creek was needed for a new regional drainage project. A reservoir, they called it, flood mitigation infrastructure, the kind of language that made taking a man's land sound like public service. But something unusual happened that morning. Because Harold didn't arrive with a lawyer's briefcase or a stack of paperwork, he arrived carrying a small cardboard box. The security guard at the door noticed it first. "Sir," he said, "all personal items need to be checked." Harold stopped calmly. "It's not personal," he said. "It's evidence." The guard raised an eyebrow. "Evidence of what?" Harold glanced toward the hearing room doors. "You'll see." The guard hesitated. Hearing rooms weren't used to physical evidence that looked like it came from a kitchen shelf. But Harold's lawyer had already cleared it with the county clerk. So the guard stepped aside. Harold walked inside. Every head in the room turned. At the front table sat Dale Thurston, the county administrator. Thurston was exactly the kind of man who expected proceedings like this to go smoothly. Pressed suit, reading glasses on a chain, a legal pad already half full of notes. Beside him sat 2 other commissioners and the county attorney, a woman named Rachel Dern, who had never lost a condemnation case. Thurston noticed the box immediately. He leaned toward his microphone. "Mr. Meacham, this is a formal proceeding. Personal items should be left outside." Harold set the box on the floor beside his chair. "It's not personal," he said again. "It's evidence." Thurston exchanged a look with Dern. "Evidence of what exactly?" Harold didn't answer. He sat down and waited. The dispute had started almost a year earlier. The Meacham farm sat on 160 acres of bottomland just south of the county line. For 3 generations, the family had worked the soil. Corn and soybeans in rotation. A small herd of Angus cattle along the creek. Hay fields on the upper slopes. Nothing fancy, just productive land that fed a family. But over the past decade, the county had approved a series of large residential developments upstream. The biggest was Pinecrest, a 300-home subdivision built on 600 acres of former farmland 2 miles north. When the trees came down and the topsoil was graded flat for streets and foundations, the water had to go somewhere. It went into Cedar Creek. Flooding along the creek had increased every year since Pinecrest was built. Roads washed out. Culverts overflowed. 2 bridges needed emergency repair. The county's solution was a reservoir, a large retention basin designed to catch floodwater before it reached the downstream developments. And the cheapest place to build it was Harold Meacham's bottomland. The county offered $4,200 per acre. Harold's lawyer argued the land was worth 3 times that. The county's appraiser disagreed. Negotiations failed. The county filed for condemnation. Harold had fought the process from the beginning. He attended every meeting. He submitted written objections. His lawyer cited 2 recent state court rulings that overturned similar condemnation actions. None of it seemed to matter. The county had engineers, consultants, environmental impact reports, and a board of commissioners who had already approved the project unanimously. The hearings dragged on for 5 months. Dern's team produced survey maps, engineering studies, hydrology models, and a 200-page environmental assessment. Each document seemed to support the same conclusion. The bottomland was the optimal site. The project was necessary. The acquisition was lawful. Meanwhile, Harold's lawyer struggled to challenge the technical arguments. He questioned the appraisal methodology. He argued that alternative sites had not been adequately evaluated. He presented testimony from neighboring farmers who described decades of stable creek conditions before the upstream developments were built. But testimony from farmers didn't carry the same weight as reports from engineers. At one point during a recess in the third hearing, Thurston had walked past Harold in the hallway. He paused and shook his head with a thin smile. "Mr. Meacham," he said quietly, "you're fighting a flood project with a handshake and a prayer." Harold didn't respond. At a county board meeting the following month, Thurston spoke to a reporter outside the building. "The project serves 40,000 residents," he said. He was smiling when he said it. "One farm can't hold back progress." A week later, Dern's office sent Harold's lawyer a final settlement offer with a note attached. "We recommend your client accept before the court date. The outcome is not in question." Harold read the note at his kitchen table. He folded it and set it aside. Then he drove to the State Agricultural Extension Office and asked to speak with someone about water testing. Now the final hearing had arrived. This was the last step before the county signed the condemnation order. One more chance for Harold to speak before the papers were filed. Most people expected him to beg. Or maybe to yell. That's what usually happened at these hearings. A farmer stands up, says something emotional about his grandfather. The board nods politely, and the papers get signed anyway. The hearing began exactly as expected. The county's lead engineer presented the drainage plan. Maps showed the proposed reservoir footprint overlapping Harold's bottomland. Diagrams illustrated how the project would redirect floodwaters away from 3 residential areas. The language was technical, confident, rehearsed. Then Dern summarized the legal basis. "The property meets all criteria for public use acquisition," she said. "The compensation offer reflects fair market value as determined by independent appraisal." Harold's lawyer stood and made his objections. "Below market appraisal, questionable public necessity, procedural irregularities in the notification process." The commissioners listened politely. One checked his phone under the table, and it was Harold's turn. He stood slowly. He wasn't a big man. 63 years old, thin from decades of physical work, hands scarred from fence wire and engine belts. He didn't look like someone who could stop a county government. But when he spoke, the room went quiet. "My family bought that land in 1951, he said. "My father cleared the timber himself. We farmed it through floods, droughts, and 3 recessions. Every year we planted. Every year we maintained the creek banks. Every year we kept that bottomland from washing away." Thurston nodded. "We appreciate your family's history with the property, Mr. Meacham, but the public interest requires—" Harold raised a hand. "I'm not finished." Thurston stopped. Harold reached down and lifted a mason jar from the cardboard box. He set it on the table directly in front of the commissioners. The liquid inside was dark, almost brown. Small particles drifted slowly near the surface. Thurston leaned back slightly. "What is that?" Harold spoke calmly. "Rainwater." The room murmured. One of the commissioners frowned. "Rainwater?" Harold nodded. "I collected it 3 days ago during the last storm." He tapped the glass gently. "But I didn't collect it from my property." Dern shifted in her seat. "This is not relevant to the condemnation proceedings." Harold continued without pausing. "I collected it from the drainage ditch that runs along County Road 14. He looked directly at Thurston. "The ditch your department built 4 years ago when you approved the Pinecrest subdivision." Thurston's expression changed, not much. Just enough for the front row to notice. Harold pointed at the jar. "That water is brown because it's full of sediment. Topsoil runoff from construction grading that was never properly stabilized." He paused. "Your own county drainage system is pushing contaminated stormwater directly into Cedar Creek." Thurston leaned toward his microphone. "Mr. Meacham, dirty water is not a legal argument." Harold didn't look at him. He kept his hand on the jar. Several farmers in the back nodded. They had all seen the creek change over the past 4 years. Muddier after every storm. High water in spring. Banks eroding where they never had before. Harold reached into the box again. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "These are water quality tests," he said, "conducted by the State Agricultural Extension Office. 3 separate sampling dates over the past 14 months. He opened the folder. Each one shows elevated sediment levels, phosphorus concentrations above 0.3 milligrams per liter, and turbidity readings that exceed state environmental standards by a factor of 4. Dern stood quickly. "Your Honor, Miss Chairman, water quality is not the subject of this hearing." Harold looked at her. "It is now." Thurston didn't stop him. He was staring at the folder. Harold turned back to the commissioners. "You're telling this board that you need my land to build a reservoir for flood control." He tapped the folder. "But these tests prove the flooding problem was caused by your own development approvals. You let builders strip 600 acres of farmland upstream without adequate drainage controls. And now the runoff is overwhelming the creek." The second commissioner had put down his phone. He was reading the water quality report. Harold wasn't finished. He pulled another document from the folder. "I called the State Environmental Compliance Office last month." Thurston visibly stiffened. Harold placed the document on the table. State letterhead. Official seal. They opened an investigation. He looked at each commissioner individually. The state found that the county's stormwater management plan for the Pinecrest development was never properly certified. He paused, "which means every drainage permit issued for that project may be invalid." Dern whispered something to Thurston. Thurston didn't respond. Harold continued, "If those permits are invalid, the county is liable for the downstream damage." He let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. "Including the flooding on my property. The swaggering entrail falcons you're now using as justification to condemn it." A farmer in the back row said quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." Harold picked up the mason jar one final time. He held it at eye level so every commissioner could see the brown water swirling inside the glass. "You can't take my land to fix a problem you created." He set the jar back on the table gently. "And this water proves you created it." The hearing room erupted in murmured conversation. Thurston called a recess. During the 20-minute break, Dern was seen making 4 phone calls in the hallway. One of the commissioners walked outside and didn't come back for 10 minutes. Thurston sat at the table reading the state compliance letter over and over. When the hearing reconvened, Thurston spoke briefly. His voice was flatter now. "The board is tabling the condemnation action pending further review of the drainage compliance issues raised today." He didn't look at Harold. "This hearing is adjourned." No vote was taken. No papers were signed. The condemnation that everyone in the county had assumed was already done had been stopped by a mason jar of dirty water. Outside the building, farmers surrounded Harold. Someone slapped him on the back. "You just beat the county with a jar of mud." Harold shook his head. He placed the jar carefully back into the cardboard box. "I didn't beat anyone." He looked back toward the county building doors. "I just showed them what their own water looked like." 3 months later, the county quietly dropped the condemnation proceedings entirely. The state investigation resulted in a compliance order requiring the county to retrofit the Pinecrest drainage system at a cost of $4.7 million. The reservoir project was redesigned to use county-owned land 2 miles east. Harold Meacham went back to farming. The 160 acres of bottomland along Cedar Creek stayed in the family, the same way it had for over 70 years. A reporter from the county paper drove out to the farm a week after the announcement. She found Harold replacing a fence post along the creek bank. She asked him how it felt to beat the county government with a jar of water. Harold pulled the post straight and tamped the dirt around the base. "I didn't beat anyone," he said. He looked toward the creek. The water was still a little muddy from the last rain, but less than before. "I just brought them something they didn't want to look at." The reporter asked one more question. What would you have done if the jar hadn't worked? Harold picked up his post driver and moved to the next hole. Collected another one, he said, and the mason jar sat on the shelf in his barn, still full of brown water, right next to his father's first set of fence pliers.